The Short Game is listener-supported on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join us on our Discord, head to theshortgame.net or patreon.com/theshortgame.
Welcome back to The Short Game, a show about short video games, games that respect your time, or scare you. I am your host, Shane Kelly, and I'm joined by my brother and bro host,
Reagan Kelly.
And this week we are covering Unpronounceable.
Yeah, I've been debating about how I'm supposed to pronounce the title of this game, even though they literally say the title in the game quite a lot. I'm going to stick to my best pronunciation, Mundaun. Mundaun is yet another example of us being extremely timely while still playing a game months after its release, because this game came out March 16th, 2021, but it just this week got a Switch port, which is why it kind of bumped it back up onto my list.
Yeah, I think this is a game that would be pretty fun on the Switch. What this is, just to set the scene, is it's a very visually striking and kind of graphically unique horror game. It takes place in a kind of a mountain village in, I believe, Romania.
Oh, no. This is Switzerland, the Swiss Alps.
Switzerland?
Yeah.
Swiss Alps. Okay, I'm glad glad you caught me there. Sorry, I was misremembering. What's the name of the language it's in?
It's Romanish, so maybe you were thinking of that.
That's what threw me. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. So.
Yeah. Really interesting little background detail about this is that it's set in this very tiny region in the Swiss Alps that it speaks its own very localized dialect, Romanish. And the entire game is voiced in Romanish. It's a very odd sound. I spent a good first half of the game until I ended up looking it up, trying to puzzle out what language was being spoken. You won't get it. It's very unique. It's apparently something like 7% of the Swiss population, and how big can that be, speak this language? So it's an extremely regional mountain dialect, and I thought that was sort of interesting. As sort of like, how many video games are made in Romanish? Probably this one and no others.
Yes, it is apparently the main language for about 40,000 people.
Wow.
So and I think that kind of a setting is really interesting, because I want to get into talking about the idea of folk horror, which is to me is one of the first examples of folk horror I've seen in a game. But I mentioned up front that this was visually striking. The thing that makes this really neat is it's a really strange game to look at. It combines two things that we see a lot in video games. One is kind of a low poly look with another thing you also sometimes see in games, which is kind of a sketchy charcoal or pencil look. But then by putting those two together, you get this visual that looks like kind of a living sketchbook. Honestly, the appearance, the look of things just generally was basically the creepiest thing about this game. And the thing that kind of made me interested in it was just looking at these screenshots and saying, what on earth could this really be? Yeah,
the really impressive thing about the art here is, it looks very interesting, but the way this look was achieved is extremely unique. The developer, this was mostly a solo development work. It's by a Swiss game developer called Hidden Fields, but that's basically the bulk of the game was done by one guy, Michael Ziegler. And the way he achieved this art style was he'd create the 3D models in, I think, he's using Unity as the engine, but whatever process he used to create the 3D models without textures. And then he would sort of unfold them and print them out on paper and sketch in with actual pencils the textures. For example, like maybe he wants to make a goat. Goats feature pretty heavily in this. Well, he has to 3D model a goat, then figure out, okay, well, if we were to unfold the 3D model of a goat onto paper, what that would look like. And then he went in and physically sketched in the goat's details, the fur, eyes, etc., with actual pencil, and then scanned that back into the computer and made that into his 3D textures. And it's a very unusual look. At a distance. Like if you're looking at things like, a scene as a whole, especially if you're outdoors where you get a nice long draw distance, it can look just a bit like sort of black and white film, right? With a bit of an odd look to it. But if you look closely at anything, everything is pencil sketched. So you see that sort of physical grain of like pencil on paper on everything. And lots of the details have this sort of like very specific look. It's really unique. I don't think I've ever seen anything that was, I've certainly seen things that attempt to do a pencil sketch like appearance, but usually they're doing that with things like shaders on top of 3D models. And here it's literally pencil sketches scanned into a computer and wrapped around the 3D models. Very, very unique.
It's hard. You really do have to see this, which, makes the medium of podcasting just the perfect way to review this game. But the visuals of this game are just strikingly dark. As you walk around, one of the things that makes horror work is a feeling of sometimes being a little bit lost and disoriented. And there are lots of sequences in this game where like you're lost in I had a moment in a burned out house kind of early on in the game where, and we'll get into the story of the game pretty soon, but there's a fair number of burned out houses, one very important one. But as you kind of go in and you're looking around, you're kind of exploring the space, and this is all charcoal textured sketches, and you kind of feel a little bit lost in that space. And then in those moments where you're pulling out, that's a great point for the game to like pop in something scary. So it is pretty cool. It also uses some of the things that we've started to see in more and more games of these like quick cuts and things like that. That in a lot of these like low poly experiences, it's one of my favorite techniques, and we've talked about it a lot in other games. But the idea of where like you the player, the viewer, do kind of filmic style quick cuts between things, and I think that's a great technique for horror because what is the number one best tool in the horror toolbox for making you jump? It's the jump scare, and what's a jump scare if not a jump cut, I guess. But let's set up the actual story, because here's something I wanted to talk about with horror games. And I don't want to derail talking about the story of this game too long, but I didn't get that far through this game. You got pretty much to the end of it. I am spending more of my time on a different horror game. I'm playing a lot of Resident Evil 8, and that has had me thinking about horror in general. And one of the things that's weird about horror in video games is most of the time when we talk about genre in video games, we're talking about gameplay genres, shooters, platformers, Metroidvania, whatever, right? Horror is a genre that is much more determined by the subject matter. And so that's a place where it's very different from other video game genres. It's really all about the subject matter. And so when you look at what you're actually doing in horror games, that actually covers just a very broad spectrum. Sometimes they play a lot more like a shooter. Sometimes they play a lot more like an adventure game. Sometimes they play more like a survival game. There's a lot of variety.
You can include some things like even the Castlevania series under the horror subgenre if you really try to.
You think about games that are definitely horror games that play. There's very popular, and it's been discussed a few times on this podcast, Doki Doki Literature Club. That's a horror game that plays like a visual novel. The horror game genre is literally all over the map in terms of gameplay. This one plays a lot more like a first-person adventure game.
I would say even like if you were to take out there are monsters in this game. We will discuss those in a little bit. But if you were to take out the monsters entirely, this would feel a little bit like a walking simulator, but not quite that. The closest thing I could connect it to, actually, were it not for the hiding from or sneaking past or occasionally fighting with monsters, this would remind me a lot more of something like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture than other. It's really in that zone where it's like you are you are journeying through a space and it's telling you a story. It occasionally takes the time to do things like playable flashback, not exactly cutscenes. There's like, playable flashback scenes, as well as sometimes taking the time to like immerse you in something really surreal. But it's mostly a journey up a mountain. And you're passing through the entire town of Mundaun on the way up to the peak. And so it's a lot like it is. Yeah, first person adventure game is probably the sort of best broad strokes description for what this is doing. But sprinkled into that are a bunch of monsters of varying degrees of scariness. So we'll talk about those in a little bit. But yeah. Sorry, Shane, I didn't mean to derail your point, but yeah, it's this one in particular is definitely playing in that like, even when this game does give you a weapon, it makes the weapon so hilariously ineffectual that it's this is mostly a game about experiencing a story while avoiding monsters.
Let's set up the story of the game, because really that is what makes a horror game is the story, and especially one that's kind of like this in the mold of adventure games. You start off, you're playing, I forget the name of the main character.
Curdin.
Yeah, okay. He's informed that his grandfather has died, and he gets a letter from the priest that his grandfather is not only dead, but dead in a barn fire. Mm-hmm. And the letter is a little bit non-specific, and it basically tells you, hey, don't bother coming. We've already buried your grandfather. There's no need to come for a funeral. And, the main character expresses some skepticism about this. And when you ride up the bus that takes you all the way up high into the mountains to Mundaun, it becomes pretty quickly clear that that letter was full of lies. In fact, the first thing that I did was to go explore the barn and then find the corpse of the grandfather in what I thought was a really, actually, genuinely spooky scene. So they have not only have they not buried the grandfather, he is dead in a barn fire. That much was true. They've not moved the body from the barn. It is still sitting there, face to face. You run into this corpse, and from there you just start kind of exploring the town.
Yeah, and obviously I'm not going to spoil any of the important details of the story here. We can do a little spoiler break at the end if you want, Shane. But the overall story is about figuring out what actually happened here. And it's a story that goes back generations to, when your grandfather was a young man. There's a sort of a mysterious figure that is at the center of all of this that you encounter pretty early. The other thing that I was actually reminded of a lot as I was playing this was the Half-Life games. Because, literally the first thing that I thought of when I was riding the bus into town was like, oh, hey, I'm on the monorail. It's Half-Life. But it has, and in a lot of ways, this also reminded me of like, what was that Half-Life 2 thing where you're like the Lost Coastline or whatever, where you're like on a you have your truck and you're like exploring a whole like chunk of the coast, sort of a journey. And this feels a lot like that in ways too, where it's telling you a story as you're doing like first person progression through a space, and you do get vehicles in this. How you explore the area is a big part of this, and we'll get to that in a sec. But yeah, the overall story is mostly just about trying to figure out what it is that led up to this very mysterious death of your grandfather. And if the fact that his corpse is still lying there in the barn isn't mysterious enough, you very quickly see like the barn fire was painted. There was a painter standing near the barn as it burned, painting a picture of the barn burning down. That's pretty weird. And there's other like weird things that creep into it. The game gets to a point where it gets quite surreal, but like never really leaves its main story, which is like always moving forward up to the peak of the mountain. At the center of this mountain is a darkness. I'm not spoiling things here, but like there's something sort of otherworldly or evil or at least really unsettling living there. And you are kind of confronting the like dark history of the town in the same way that you're trying to investigate your dad or your grandfather's death. You do that by exploring the town, and that's really what I think is the standout cool thing about this game. Like, it starts off with a pretty small area, just the small area. You ride up on the bus, and it just opens this tiny little area to you that includes your grandfather's, burned down barn, his house, a small chapel, and I think, one or two other things, like a little graveyard, that sort of thing. You meet a couple of sort of off characters, like the priest there. But it very soon begins to open up additional areas to you. You get access to your grandfather's Mouvelle. The Mouvelle is, I think, the real star of this game in a way. It's his sort of a truck shaped hay loader. It's like a truck that you can drive around that has like a big hay baler in the back where you can drive over hay and it like auto bales it for you. And that becomes your main mode of transportation through the rest of the game, is driving this hay baler around. Fortunately, it's really fun to drive the hay baler. That opens up a lot of the game for you. Now you can drive up the mountain, and it opens up a larger area that includes some farmland and a bunch of other, buildings. And, every building has little things to explore. The game really consistently keeps exploration fun and interesting by giving you a lot of little things to find. Even if you're not finding like plot relevant stuff as you're exploring all of these buildings on the way up the mountain, you're finding little stuff like boxes of coffee, boxes of matches, and other little things like that. And the game has, it's not exactly an RPG, but it has stats for you. So you have a stat for your physical health. You have a stat for your courage and a stat for your marksmanship. And each of those, you can find things in the world that help you level them up. Marksmanship is easy. You just pick up pages out of a gun manual. But things like courage, you have to make coffee to refill to increase your courage. And that involves finding coffee, finding matches, finding wood, finding water, putting it into a pot, putting the pot on the stove, lighting the fire, brewing the coffee, drinking the coffee. This is this multi-step process. And what that means is that every time you are exploring any space, even if you're just, looking in a basement, I found some matches. Matches are the best thing to find in this game because you not only can you use them to make coffee, but you can use them to light fires. And here's spoiler for the first enemy that you will encounter in the game. Lighting fires is extremely useful when the very first enemy and most common enemy you encounter in this game are walking haystacks. They are not scary. They're kind of ridiculous, but here's the thing about the combat in this game. The game starts off. There's nothing around that's there to scare you, right? But as you progress up the mountain into larger and larger areas, and the game starts opening up, you start finding that the spaces that you've already explored are suddenly inhabited by these walking haystack monsters. They look sort of as if you'd taken a desiccated corpse and baled it in hay until you had a massive sort of pointy-topped haystack with arms and legs.
They look kind of like a Wicker Man, right? That's kind of the illusion you're going for, right?
Yeah, they very much do, yeah. And I mean, hay is a huge part of this game. You're driving a hay baler. There's hay in piles and stacks everywhere, which can make it harder to spot the hay monsters.
The pitchfork is your main weapon.
Yeah. You don't get it. There is a gun in this game, but you don't get it until like literally the last hour of what for me was about an 8-hour game. And so the pitchfork is your main weapon. You can stab these hay monsters. It takes 3 stabs to kill one of these hay monsters. And you only really get about 3 stabs with these pitchforks before they break. So you really don't want to confront these things. And they have a ranged attack, whereas you mostly don't until the end of the game. So most of what you're doing is sneaking around these things, although you can get really creative by lighting hay on the ground on fire to light, to have that fire spread and light these hay monsters on fire. So all things considered, I think the encounter design with the hay monsters was pretty good, if a little bit frustrating at times. But the hay monsters were not scary to me. Just something about their design, I found them really kind of laughable right from the get-go. Like the first time I saw one of these things moving around, I wasn't expecting it. I didn't know that was what the sort of main scary monster of this game was. And man, these things ain't it, right? Like they're just so silly.
I kind of want to talk about this for a second, because I feel like this is a common. There's similar issues that are really common as ways that horror games get derailed for me. And I kind of just want to ask the question, should horror games have combat? And the answer is, for most of them, they do. If I look at Resident Evil 8, which I'm playing right now, that definitely has combat. In fact, it has a great deal of combat. But a lot of the games in the Resident Evil series, like I guess my favorite is Resident Evil 4. And 4 was really popular because it leaned very heavily into the combat. But if you've played that game, you know that about halfway through it, you go under you spend the first half of the game like really afraid because the combat is stressful and you're scrounging for every bullet. And then you go underground and fight some more monsters, and then you come up with a rocket launcher and then just wipe the monsters off the map for the rest of the game. And so to me, I think it kind of I don't think you need it. Like, to me, the most effective horror is the horror that is more story based or psychological, right? And a lot of these games give you combat as a way to just, it's like, here it is, dude. This is a video game. Enjoy your guns.
Well,
right?
I don't know, man.
What do you think?
I think that's really it's really selling short a lot of the horror genre. Like, yes, a lot of them have combat, but and first of all, I agree that combat-free horror can be more effective. One of my favorite horror games of all time is Soma, which, if you haven't played it, I've been trying to convince these losers to play it for the show for literally 4 years. And Soma is a survival horror game that takes place in a series of sort of underwater labs. There's these very horrifying creatures in it. They're just sort of effective in, as like scary monsters. But the main interaction you have with them is running away. There's no like weapon. There are some things you can do occasionally to them, but very, very little. Mostly your only recourse is to sneak or run away from them. And that game worked really, really well. But there's other horror games. I know a lot of people love this game. I didn't quite what's it called? The Alien Isolation. Where you can't really fight the aliens, you really only have to run away from them. And that game, it felt a little too disempowering. I had spent too much time having to sort of wait in a closet for what felt like hours until the alien moved on, because I didn't have any other option. There was no way for me to attack it. This game it strikes a little bit of a balance. You have a pitchfork, but really all it does is knock the haystack monsters down, unless you want to just stand there stabbing them 3 or 4 times. And if you're contending with more than one of these haystack monsters, that's not going to work. You're basically sacrificing your weapon if you decide to actually kill one. But what it does do is, if you're, let's say, in a hallway and there's one of these things coming towards you, there's a way to push it out of the way. And that's basically what combat is in this game. It's a way to open up some space to get past these monsters. I ended up my issue with the quote unquote combat in this game is mostly with its, and I'm sure maybe this was just, maybe this was me. It has a fear system, your bravery or courage meter or whatever, that basically just affects when you're confronted with these scary monsters, you kind of get rooted to the spot. Your legs slow down. You can't walk as fast. under, if there's a lot of them around or you're very scared, it plays scary sounds, and eventually you just stop being able to move, which I found really frustrating, actually. Like, eventually I built up my courage a little bit enough that, like, I could, I didn't have to run the opposite direction every time I saw one of these things. I had enough courage to sneak past them without, like, my feet going numb and being rooted to the spot. But I ended up, like, I ended up about halfway through this game finding some places where I got really frustrated and turning the combat down to easy, which honestly I recommend doing on this one. I don't think there's any benefit, really. Like, it's not like there's amazing combat design here. I kind of opted out of it for the most part, and I was kind of glad that I did by about halfway through, because this whole idea of, like, your scary situations route you to the spot just means that, like, oh, if I'm trying to run away, like, maybe I'm even, like, past the things. They're in my rear view, but I'm just, like, creeping past them and getting pelted with hay, which after about a minute or two will kill me. And after, like, enough deaths of this kind where I was just sort of, like, felt like I was walking through molasses, I just turned it down to easy.
I think it does have to be a balance, right? There has to be a balance to the combat. And I think in a lot of ways, having some way to defend yourself makes the scary monsters more effective, right? If you can't defend yourself and the thing shows up and kills you, and you get the "you are dead" screen, and it takes you back to the last save point every time, that eventually becomes a lot less scary than knowing that every encounter is going to cost you something. It cost you some health, cost you your pitchfork, and that you might
your precious ammunition.
Your precious ammo, and that you might then have to continue after that, and it makes you feel kind of more hunted and more disempowered. So I think there is obviously a place for it, but that place is defending yourself and not so much going on the attack. But most of these games have some point where it makes that shift, where you've been disempowered and on the defense for the whole game, and then it's time for you to turn the tables on the monsters.
I think that's very specifically a Resident Evil disease, Shane. Like, I agree that there's other games that do that, because Resident Evil's been very successful. But, like, that, man, like, I played, I think you also played Resident Evil 7. I haven't played 8. I know you're playing it right now, but, like, 7, it's so stark in that, where, like, you spend the first half of that game without any way to fight back, and it's just, like, wet your pants scary. Like, there's you're crawling through sewers full of dead bodies and only emerging to be harassed by a family of terrifying Texas Chainsaw Massacre hillbillies.
Yeah, that game, by the way, played in VR, game is too scary. It's literally too scary for me to play.
I couldn't play that game without asking Jamie to sit in the room with me for the first half. After you get past that first half, the game suddenly shifts gears and becomes a traditional Resident Evil game where you've got, funny looking keys to put in funny looking keyholes, and you've got 3 guns with 4 types of ammo and lots of green herbs to eat to heal yourself, and it becomes very video gamey. And but that first half or so of the game was just absolutely wet your pants scary, and that in some ways, like, made me appreciate the second half. I was like, oh, it's a video game after all. But, like, it is definitely a weird tonal shift.
There's also, when we talk about tone in horror, horror has all these myriad little teeny tiny subgenres to it, and horror games are the same thing. And again, we're talking about horror games as if they're this genre monopole, and they are not. Like, they are so many different little mini genres, and I was talking about the different kinds being, like, different ways you play them, like adventure game style, shooter style, whatever. There's also, just coming out of the world of horror literature and film, there's all these mini genres as well. And there's this whole genre of folk horror that this is a part of, but that's also really having a moment. So some examples of folk horror that, I think when I say it's been having a moment, I kind of am thinking back to the movie Midsummer and The Witch, and there's other examples as well. This is one of the first times where I really feel like that's landing in video games.
Yeah, I think the one example I can think of otherwise is a game that we covered many years ago on this show, and I think is really an amazing game called Year Walk. Year Walk is a Scandinavian game about a full. I think these both have researched some like folk beliefs of a specific very very like small regional culture, and then are kind of taking those scary stories, scary folk tales, and bringing them to life. Year Walk was about a folk practice of trying to tell the future by walking around a church in a spooky churchyard at midnight on the new year. By the way, really play Year Walk. I actually just went in to check to see if it was still playable. I'm pretty sure you can still get it on iOS. I checked the Steam version; it's still up and works. I would 100% recommend playing Year Walk. Go back and listen to our episode on it. But that game was stunning, and I was reminded of it many times here, because here it's taking these like things that I don't know. I didn't do the research to know like what of this game is like specifically a Swiss Alps folk belief, but there's all sorts of little stuff in it that's very strange and has the feeling of like, wow, that's a really interesting like element of this like local culture that's also really creepy. For example, there's a thing that you encounter when you go to sleep in your grandfather's house, where up on the wall next to the bed, there's this board, this sort of broad wooden board with a hole in it, and maybe a dozen or more large metal spikes sticking out of it. And when you examine it, the narrator says, a wurg, I'm going to probably mispronounce this. Apologies, I didn't look up this pronunciation in advance. A wurg heckle. Grandpa used to put it on his chest before he went to sleep. And when you go to sleep in your grandpa's house, you take this horribly spiked board with a hole in it down off of the wall and place it on your chest with the spikes facing up. And it says that he put this on his chest to stop spirits from assaulting him while he was asleep. I forget exactly how it phrased it, but like this idea that you'd keep this spiky board next to your bed and put it on your body before you go to sleep, so that if something tried to get you in the night, it would get spiked. That's like a really cool little detail. And this game is full of little details like that. There's a lot of stuff in it that I'm also like not sure is rooted in reality. A big part of this backstory of this town is that it was the site of a battle that's sort of an unspecified war between the locals of this area and somebody else. And I'm pretty sure all the details of that are fictitious. I did a little bit of looking and, looked up Mundaun on Wikipedia, for example, which is a real place in Switzerland. I didn't find any details about any wars being fought there. I'm not exactly sure when this is meant to be taking place. The flag that they're all flying doesn't seem to be real. It's I don't actually know like who was fighting who in the battle that's supposed to have taken place here. I think that part is fictitious, but like it's clearly mixing fact and fiction. They went to the length of writing all the dialogue and voicing all the dialogue in this incredibly regional language, which is, it shows real commitment to engaging with a sort of a micro culture here. So I don't know what is and is not real. And part of that is the cool part, right? Like there's spooky stuff here. Spooky stories that feel like they could be ripped from the local folktales of an interesting culture, and some of them are probably real, and some of them are probably not. But I think that's really a cool thing about this style of horror. Is it like it feels it really feels real. It feels like something where like, ooh, if I took the wrong turn on vacation in the Swiss Alps, I could run into one of these creatures,
Yeah, that is absolutely not the vibe in Resident Evil 8, which I am going to talk about for a few minutes. Resident Evil 8 is very... so I was kind of surprised by the overall kind of theme of Resident Evil 8 so far, because 7 was based around this really like closed-in space, and... it kind of broke with a lot of the traditions of the series that had kind of really started to rely on kind of certain tropes. Like Resident Evil 4 took this game that was like, you're on tank controls and you're, just on the run the whole time. And it gave you something that was more shooter-like, right? And then that was a big shift. And then Resident Evil 7 was another time where they like started to kind of fall into a pattern. They were like, well, what if we did something totally different? We made it just a escape room full of freaks trying to claw at you through the walls, right? And now with 8, it expands out to the size. The concept is the village, right? And it has superficially a lot in common with this game. Like it is a game where you're exploring a kind of a European. An isolated European village, right? But the vibe is very fairy tale inspired. Like it's actually sets the tone early by having your player character, who's the same one from 7, by the way, come out and he's reading a fairy tale book to his daughter. They have moved nearly inexplicably to the middle of nowhere in Europe, to this horrible little town that is kind of thereafter immediately overwhelmed by these monsters. And it's has been under the reign of these creatures forever. But the whole vibe is kind of high drama, high camp, kind of fairy tale inspired. So it's a very different end of kind of that same folk horror vibe. I'm not that far into it. I'm definitely still in the first third of the game. But it's pretty different. It's also very different from Resident Evil 7, which, it's weird, but I do love to be surprised in a horror game. I do love a good surprise.
I'm really looking forward to giving that one a shot. I'm kind of waiting for it to take a dive in price, because with these kinds of games, big horror games, I tend to just sort of play them when I want something scary, and I'm not like dying to get my hands on it at the moment. But I'm looking forward to checking it out. Seems really fun. They certainly have you encountered the lady that everyone's horny for yet?
Oh, absolutely. And while I don't share that particular predilection, I do find her to be a great video game character. You're in a mansion. Kind of her mansion is a really unique and interesting space to explore. You have a lot of it's a really big, cool, very highly detailed space.
By the way, we're now fully out of talking about Mundaun. I'll go ahead and just do our outro now so we can continue talking about Resident Evil 8. Mundaun is available on all of the platforms. It came out already earlier in the year on PC, on PlayStation 4, on, the Xbox One and S. I don't know for sure if it's on 5. I think it would be nice if you have the option to play this on the highest resolution display that you have. Sit close to put on your 4K TV, because there's a lot of nice detail to be observed in the textures. I played it on PC, and surprisingly, it really ran my graphics card. It really heated up my graphics card. I think maybe just because of the high resolution textures or something. But it's definitely a game to play on something where you can push the pixels if you can, even though the polygons are pretty pretty basic. The textures, I think, are really really interesting to look at. But of course, also it's on Nintendo Switch now. So if that's your best way to play it, go for it. I think it's going to be perfectly fine there. And it is $19.99 on Steam. And I think it's also on the Epic Game Store. If the Epic sale, the big sale with the coupons and everything, is still going on as you hear this, this was part of that sale as well. So you can pick it up if it's still available. I don't know when that ends or when you're listening to this. It's a mystery. But yeah, I would definitely recommend checking out Mundaun. I really did enjoy it once I decided to kind of give up on the combat and sort of push my way past all the haystacks and explore the story. So I would recommend folks check it out. Shane, let's get back to talking. Do you have any more to report about Resident Evil 8?
Sure. So I'm definitely enjoying it. I'm still going to continue to play it. I think maybe I should just... this is my podcast. I can make this a recurring segment where I don't play the game that we are ostensibly supposed to be covering, and instead play the hot new Capcom title that everyone's talking about.
Yeah, how did you do with Monster Hunter? You still playing that one?
I am still playing Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter is great. I'm not like that good at Monster Hunter, but I really enjoy it. It's a really fun game to be getting back into. I love Monster Hunter because I have a lot of friends who enjoy it, and it's a really great social game. And you know, if it scratches that itch for you, that's great. There's basically a bottomless well of monsters. To someone who's more dedicated, like I think if I were playing it more or less nonstop, there would be a point where I would run out of the monsters. But functionally, to me, there is unlimited monsters because there's more monsters than I have time for. And so it is fun to kind of get into those kinds of games where, it's tactically interesting. It's, there's a grind that's satisfying. There's more to learn about it and about the franchise and about the overall, the whole deal than meets the eye at first. And they've made this one so incredibly accessible that it feels like one of those games that's like, one gameplay session, a few minutes to learn, and then like a lifetime to master and to beat all the zombies and not zombies, monsters. They're not zombies. They're actually dragons. I'm mixing my Capcoms. Resident Evil 8, though.
That one's got the zombies.
Surprisingly, not super zombified compared to the past Resident Evil games. In fact, the first scene where you really are cut loose in the village, and by the way, guys, spoiler alerts, I'm going to talk about all the parts of this game that I've played so far, which is about the first third. The old Resident Evil games were really zombie heavy and, dogs jumping through windows and stuff like that. This game is, like I said, it's kind of folklore or fairy tale inspired. The same character who was in Resident Evil 7, Ethan Winters, and his wife, who you saved in the first game. There's a little recap. They have had a baby and moved on, but inexplicably they have decided never to speak of the horrors that they saw when he saved her from a house full of freaks. So now they've moved to Eastern Europe, in unknown place, and then out of nowhere, one of the Resident Evil characters that I can't keep track of, Chris Redfield, shows up and just like guns down your wife in your own home. That was a true moment of... Actually, the first moment of horror that I had in the game was the fact that you take your baby and you put your baby in a crib, and the crib is full of those like thick padded crib bumpers that, like, as I was picking my child up from the hospital, they were like, don't use these, they kill babies. So I was like, okay. But,
it's very funny how, like, I saw that exact reaction from all of, like, parent Twitter.
Every parent that played this game.
I was like, no, don't put your child in that death trap. Apparently that was not the point. I wonder if the developers just were like went on Google image search and was like, scary crib. It was like, yeah, we'll put these things on.
Maybe. But anyway, it pretty quickly turns to just sort of your typical survival horror in a pretty large, fairly open kind of village environment. I mean, that's the whole concept of the game. It's the village. And you're being attacked by these huge, strong, fast kind of werewolves. I mean, they seem to be werewolves. They're basically werewolves. I think they're referred to as lycans. They're not like hairy as werewolf. They just look like really big, scary guys that run at you and try and bite you. The things that I'm loving in this game, the villains so far are just top notch, and there's a lot of them. And then the other thing I'm just loving is just how over the top and like graphic the like injuries to the main character get. And this, I really have to spoiler alert on this. There is a moment that I just fucking lost it. Once you reach the castle of the Lady Dimitrescu, right? You're sneaking around, you're running. A lot of this game, like, as is the kind of tradition for Resident Evil games, you are finding chem fluid and herbs, and you put them together and you make the healing potion and you pour it on yourself when you're hurt, right? That's basically how these games always work. Is you're doing a lot of crafting, because that's survival horror for you. Over and over again, Ethan Carter is it just gets his hands absolutely wrecked, because it's like a first person game, and so one of the best ways that they can like show you being injured in first person is to hurt you by injuring your hands. And so just in the first like third of the game, like I was like, there's no way he can still hold a gun. They put hooks through his hands and hung him from them. And then he like tore his hands open to free himself from the hooks. There's no way he could use those hands ever again. But then it just continued to ramp that up. And there's a point in this game where your first big encounter with Lady Dimitrescu, she grows these gigantic claws and she's chasing you around this basement. And you're trying to escape the basement, and you grab one of the handles that you've been using to open the doors, and she gets to you, and she uses these freakishly long claws to cut your hand completely off. And then you're like, and Ethan just runs away, leaving the hand. And you have to double back and pick up the hand, and then it goes as an item into your inventory. And I was like, oh, shit. And then when you finally evade her, you're in like an elevator on your way up. He puts the hand, which by the way has a sleeve attached. It's more like a forearm. He puts it back on, pulls out a jar of this chem fluid, and just pours it over his like severed wrist, like flexes his fingers and is like, I'm okay. And that was the moment where I realized, this is completely self-conscious camp. Like 7 was not this. 7 was like hardcore fear.
Well, okay, it wasn't at first, but like the thing about 7 was like it starts with the like hardcore, really, really deep scare stuff, but then it throws the camp at you. Its camp was like, now you're in the room with the dog-shaped key that opens the dog-shaped door, like that kind of thing. And like that is its own kind of camp. It's like it's self-consciously video gamey. Like you could tell that it was like the developers were like saying, I see you, Resident Evil fan, and you are welcome here, because here are all of the things you remember from prior Resident Evil games. But like,
yes.
the like,
and all of that is
reattaching
present
the hand
in this one as well.
Yeah, that's a different kind of camp.
I loved it because when his hand was severed, I lost it. I screamed. Like that was great. And but I was thinking, like, what are we gonna do with the rest? I use that hand for everything in this game. This is a game that is primarily a shooter. Like there's more gunplay. Once you get equipped, there's more gunplay in this game than in any Resident Evil game that I've played in a long while. I've skipped a lot of them, but it's definitely more than I was used to. 7 was the one that really brought me back to the series, and that was kind of toned down. So it was kind of interesting to kind of ramp back up into this. And I was like, what? And then he reattached it, and I just lost it for a second time. So that's the kind of horror game this is. I'm absolutely loving it. I'm going to keep playing it. What I will say for it is all of the elements of it, the survival pieces, the horror is effective, the campiness is fun, the characters are great, and the gameplay itself really good, really satisfying. I know you were complaining about Mundaun having kind of sketchy combat. This game, it keeps you on the run, it keeps you running, but even during that, like, the gunplay is fun. Part of that is just, you know, good effective guns, and part of that is really cool enemy design. Like, the enemies move in ways where they're pretty effective at dodging and keeping, you know, tricky to shoot, right? They're moving in really unnatural, herky-jerky ways. You know, some of them seem to be pretty immune to bullets, but not in a in like a big bag of HP kind of way. You're not just unloading into them. You have to really keep your distance and keep yourself moving, and that means lots of shooting while walking backwards, which means, you know, the level design becomes really important. So yeah, I think I'm having a great time with it. I am going to continue to play it. Can't wait to find out what happens to Ethan and what if he gets his baby back. I don't know. There's obviously something weird going on. I mean, I guess that's the understatement of the year.
Sounds like a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to checking it out.
I'm having a great time with it.
So, do we have some what's making us happy this week before we wrap it on up?
I think my coverage of Resident Evil 8 is kind of an extended what's making us happy this week.
All right, I'll count it. Listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Short Game. You can find us on the internet at www.theshortgame.net, where you'll find our contact form, you'll find a link to our Patreon. The Patreon also will give you a link to our Discord, which is where we talk about the show and plan the show. So every one of our Patreon subscribers at even just $1 a month gets instant access to Discord, where you can chat with us about the games you're playing. We'll chat about the games that are coming up on the show if you want previews, and just a general good place to hang out on the internet.
Yep.
You can also find the show on Twitter at _shortgame, or you can find me on Twitter at RayganK. That's RayGanK. And Shane, where can people find you?
Also on Twitter at 8BitShane.
And once again, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of The Short Game.